Hello. In this in-class activity, we're going to demonstrate how to do some simple calculations based upon the characteristics of normal distribution. These characteristics of normal distribution refer to several things. First, we know a normal distribution is a symmetrical distribution. On both sides of the mean, you have half of the cases distributed. Also, we know that there are several very important empirical values regarding normal distribution. The first value, here is the mean of normal distribution. On both sides of the mean, one standard deviation, that is, one standard deviation below the mean and one standard deviation above the mean. Within this interval, there are approximately 68.26% of all cases. So on either side of the mean, you have half of that, 34.13% on this side below the mean and 34.13% on this side above the mean. And the second value, you have this larger interval, two standard deviation on both sides of the mean. Here, this mean is two standard deviation below the mean, two standard deviation above the mean. Within this interval, there are approximately 95.44% of all cases. Again, half of them is below the mean, half of those cases are above the mean. The third empirical value is the three standard deviation on both sides of the mean of a normal distribution. Within this interval, there are approximately 99.74% of all cases. Half of them is below the mean, half of them are above the mean. So these are important characteristics that we are going to use to help us to do the simple calculations in this in-class activity. Question number 1. Between what two numbers do the middle 68.26% of observations fall? Now, this is a very helpful device if you have the habit to draw a diagram based upon what you can get from the question. Okay. Now the question tells us there are two numbers. Between them, there are the middle 68.26% of all cases, of all observations. Now, this is the entire distribution of the normal distribution. As we said in this question, for this in-class activity, we have this normal distribution with the mean 78, the standard deviation 6.3, and we use this notation to succinctly express the notion that this is a normal distribution with the mean 78 and standard deviation 6.3. The first number is the mean, the second number here is the standard deviation. So in this diagram for the first question, here 78 in the middle is the mean. This shaded areas is colorful, this orange color area is the middle 68.26%. This percentage of cases are bound within this interval by these two numbers. And this question asks us between what two numbers do this middle 68.26% of observations fall. That is, this question really asks what are the two values that form the lower bound and upper bound of this interval. So this is what the question trying to ask. What are the values of x1 and x2? Now, based upon the characteristics of normal distribution, we know that 68.26%, here this percentage seems correspond to this percentage. By looking at this chart, we know that within the interval around the mean, one standard deviation below the mean and one standard deviation above the mean, there are approximately 68.26% of cases, and that really kind of tell us that x1 it looks like is the one standard deviation below the mean, and x2 is the one standard deviation above the mean, and that is what makes this two interval. Between the two intervals, you have approximately 68.26% of all cases. And from looking at this chart, we realize that based upon this percentage, we know that x1 must be one standard deviation below the mean, and x2 must be the one standard deviation above the mean. So if we know this fact, then we can calculate to find out that what should be the value x1 which form the one standard deviation below the mean, and what should be the value of x2 which form the one standard deviation above the mean, and we can calculate those x1 and x2. We can eventually answer these questions. So now let's first address the value of x1. We know x1 is one standard deviation below the mean. Therefore, we use the mean here, the value in the middle, or here, 78, the mean minus one standard deviation, because we realize that x1 must be a value that gives us one standard deviation below the mean. So it's one standard deviation below the mean can be calculated by using the mean minus one standard deviation. Mean is 78, one standard deviation is 6.3. You complete the calculation, you obtain 71.7. So 71.7 should be the value that corresponds to one standard deviation below the mean. Following the similar principle, we know that x2 should be one standard deviation above the mean. So we use this formula to calculate x2 should be a value where mean mu plus one standard deviation. Then you plug in the actual values of the mean and standard deviation 78 plus 6.3, and that gives us 84.3. And so 84.3 should be this value that corresponds to one standard deviation above the mean. So far, the calculation really, again, is based upon the characteristics of normal distribution, because we know that for normal distribution between this lower bound and the upper bound, there are 68.26% of all cases. But the lower bound is one standard deviation below the mean, and the upper bound is one standard deviation above the mean. Based upon this, we know that x1 must be a value that is one standard deviation below the mean. Therefore, we calculate the value of x1 by using the mean minus one standard deviation below the mean. So that is 78 minus 6.3. That gives us 71.7. Similarly, we know that the x2 must be one standard deviation above the mean, so that must be the mean plus one standard deviation. 78 plus 6.3, that gives us 84.3. So 71.7 must be this value, which is one standard deviation below the mean. 84.3 must be this value, that is one standard deviation above the mean. Within this interval, one standard deviation below the mean and one standard deviation above the mean, within this interval, there are approximately 68.26% of all cases. So that answers the question. So we spent a little bit more time on this very first question to make sure that you understand the process, the logic we use to guide our calculation. Now, in your assignment, I would also like to see you write out those values, draw these diagrams like that to make sure that everything is very clear to yourself, also to me when I come to grade your work. Question number 2. What percentage of observations has a score between 59.1 and 96.9? Again, it's a good habit to draw a diagram before you begin to solve the problem. This is a normal distribution with a mean 78 right here. And this question gave us two values, 59.1 here and 96.9 here. The question asks us what percentage of observations has a score between these two values. So in other words, this question asks us what is the size of this shaded area, of this colored area, in terms of percentages. What percentage of cases are located between 59.1 and 96.9? Now, we need to answer this question based upon the characteristics of normal distribution. Look at this chart. We have to look at the chart to determine what the percentage of cases are in here, also are in here. For that reasons, we need to determine is 59.1 is one standard deviation below the mean 78. If it is 1%, if 59.1 is one standard deviation below the mean, then we know it would correspond to this point. And if that is the case, we know between the mean and the one standard deviation, you would have 34.13% of cases. But if 59.1 is two standard deviation below the mean, and that would correspond to this point, and you would have these two percentages put together, 34.13% plus 13.59%. And also, if 59.1 is three standard deviation below the mean, that would correspond to this point, then you would have very different percentage number for this area. So a very crucial thing for us to determine is how many standard deviation are there between 59.1 and 78. And this is one thing that I'd like you guys to know, that this is the very crucial thing to know. We have to know that between 59.1 and 78, how many standard deviations are there. And there's a simple way to calculate that. You simply use the difference between 59.1 and 78 here, divided by the standard deviation 6.3. You see 59.1 minus the mean 78 divided by the standard deviation, that gives you -3. Now 3 means 3 standard deviation. The negative sign means it is 3 standard deviation below the mean. So with this -3, we know that 59.1 corresponds to this point in this distribution. Correspond to this point. Okay. So we solved 1/2 of the problem. So we know that 59.1 is 3 standard deviation below the mean. So the size of this area corresponds to all these percentages put together. What about the 96.9? We use the same method to figure out between 96.9 and 78, which is the mean, how many standard deviations are there. So we use 96.9 minus 78 and divided by the standard deviation 6.3. That gives us a positive 3. That means that 96.9 is 3 standard deviation. But the positive sign tells us that this value, 96.9, is above the mean. So now we know that we have 2 values. They are 3 standard deviation below the mean and 3 standard deviation above the mean. Given the characteristics of normal distribution, what should be the size of this interval? In other words, what percentage of cases should be located within this interval bound by 3 standard deviation below the mean and above the mean? Now looking at this chart, we realize that 3 standard deviation below the mean and above the mean, you should have approximately 99.74% of cases, and that helps us to answer this question. So you have 99.74% cases that are located between these 2 values. Question number 3. Take an observation randomly from the normal distribution. What is the probability that this observation has a value between 59.1 and 65.4? Okay, let's first draw this diagram to understand what question is asking us. This is a normal distribution with the mean at 78. Now this question gave us 2 values, 59.1 and 65.4. Both values are below the mean, so we should draw them on the left side of 78, 59.1 and 65.4. And this question asks, what is the probability that this observation fall between these 2 values? So in other words, the question asks us, what is the size of this interval in terms of a percentage of cases? Again, based upon the characteristics of normal distribution, we follow what we have done so far. We know that we need to figure out between 59.1 and 78 how many standard deviations are there. From the last question, we know that there are 3 standard deviations between the mean and 59.1. What about between 65.4 and 78? How many standard deviations are there? So we need to follow the similar steps that we have taken so far to solve this question. Okay, so let's follow through those steps. First, we try to figure out between 51.9 and 78 how many standard deviations are there. So we follow these steps: 59.1 minus 78 divided by 6.3, and give us the -3. That tells us that 59.1 is 3 standard deviations below the mean. In other words, from 59.1 to 78, there are so from 59.1 to 78, the size of this area, from 59.1 to 78, it is half of 99.74%. So it is 49.87%. So we know 59.1 is 3 standard deviation below the mean. So it should have, so from 59.1 to the middle to the mean, you should have half of the 99.74%. That's why you have a half of 99.74%, and which is 49.87%. Similarly, let's figure out between 65.4 and 78 how many standard deviations are there. We use 65.4 minus 78 divided by standard deviation 6.3. That gives us -2. Then we know that from 65.4 to 78, these 2 standard deviation is below the mean because we have this negative sign. So that tells us that from 65.4 to the mean 78, this area, what is the size over here? What percentage of cases are located here in this interval? 65.4 is 2 standard deviation below the mean. And we know that from this chart, 2 standard deviation on both sides of the mean, there are approximately 95.44%. Now we are dealing with half of that, so this must be half of the 95.44%. So this is a half of the 95.44%. So we know that from 65.4 to 78, there's 47.72% of cases. Now you see, from 59.1 to the middle, you have 49.87% of cases. Then from 65.4 to the middle, you have 47.72% of cases. Now what we want to know, what the question is asked here, is what percentage of cases are within this interval? How do we figure that out? Think about that. From here to here, you have 49.87%. Then from here to here, you have 47.72%. Then you have to determine from here to here, what is the percentage of cases. I believe some of you already realize that you simply use 49.87% minus 47.72%, and that the difference must be the size of this interval. So that exactly the case. The probability for a case to fall between 59.1 and 65.4 is the difference between these two percentages, 2.15. So that is how to find answers answer to this question. Again, in your assignment, I like to see that you draw diagrams, you have those expressions, also you express probabilities using the correct mathematical notation.